Communism versus capitalism. Devious backroom dealings. And the threat of nuclear apocalypse. That's right, today on the History Chronicles we are going to be looking at the origins of the Cold War. World War II had united two very different countries against the forces of the Axis powers. The USA was a capitalist democracy that had at its very roots the rights and the freedoms of man. The US Constitution, drafted from 1787 to 89, established key bodies of government that aimed to guarantee free and fair elections and the equitable practice of law. In the early 20th century, the USA had remained an isolationist power, but its political influence had grown significantly following its involvement in the First World War and the growth of its industries throughout the 1920s. Its free and open society encouraged capitalism, allowing its citizens to accrue large amounts of wealth and pursue private business to develop the economy. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also had its roots in the idea of fairness and equality. However, its history had taken a different turn. The Communist Revolution of 1917 had ousted the autocratic Tsar Nicholas II from power and had resulted in 6 years of violent civil war that had ravaged the entire country. Communism had aimed to right the sufferings of the Russian people under the Tsar. This ideology called for a massive redistribution of wealth and resources in Russian society that would benefit everyone, rather than just the few. But this was easier to achieve in theory rather than in practice. The first leader of the Soviet state, Vladimir Lenin, had died suddenly in 1924. Quickly, Joseph Stalin, who was not actually liked by Lenin, took over the Soviet government and soon transformed the USSR into a communist dictatorship. Wealth and resources in the USSR were state-controlled, but fed an enormous machine that was far removed from accountability to its people. The USSR had entered World War II on the side of Nazi Germany, with Hitler and Stalin carving up Poland between them in a massive joint invasion of 1939. However, for both leaders, the short-lived alliance, called the Nazi-Soviet Pact, may well just have been a ploy for time. Although Stalin himself refused to believe that a Nazi attack was imminent, it was clear that the Nazi regime in Germany had long harboured hostility towards communism and the USSR. Hitler had repeated in his speeches that he sought to expand Germany eastwards to obtain Lebensraum, or living space. The Nazi-Soviet Pact gave the USSR more time to rearm and face the German invasion of its territories. This huge invasion came in the form of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where 3.5 million German soldiers mounted what was the largest land invasion in history. No longer Germany's ally, from 1941 onwards the USSR received financial support from the USA and other Western allies as they fought Nazism as a united front. In 1943, the Allies, chief among them America, Britain and the USSR, had met in Tehran in modern-day Iran to discuss the plans for the future after the Second World War. Here it was agreed that the US and the UK would commit to a grand invasion of France, named Operation Overlord, that would create a second front in Europe against the Nazi regime. Stalin, the leader of the USSR, had pushed for this for some time, given that his forces had been fighting Germany almost alone since 1941. More significantly in the long term, however, at Tehran the first discussions took place about the nature of the world after war. Here, President Roosevelt of the USA had introduced the idea of an international organisation that would act as a venue and facilitator for discussion. This would, hopefully, avoid the need for future war. This was, of course, the United Nations. Such an organisation, called the League of Nations, had in fact existed before the outbreak of World War II, but it had been limited in its effectiveness with the exclusion of some nations, and particularly the absence of the USA. Roosevelt wanted a new international body with the USA, and to an extent the USSR, at its heart. The Allies also discussed at Tehran how Germany would be divided. At this point it seemed that Germany would be divided between the Allies in the West and the USSR, but it was as yet unclear as to how this would take place. By the beginning of 1945, however, things were becoming clearer. Germany was on its knees following the massive attack of Operation Overlord and the Soviet Union's invasion of German territories in the east. The Second World War had exacted a heavy toll on the forces of the Soviet Union. over 25 million Russians had been killed between 1939 and 1945. Many of these had died as a direct result of the conflict. Others had fallen victim to disease and starvation as a result of the Nazi invasion of the USSR and the brutal policies of their own leader, Joseph Stalin. Similarly, the USA had paid a high price for its involvement in yet another war that had begun in Europe. They had become embroiled in the conflict when a hostile Japan had launched a surprise attack on their naval base Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. A vicious conflict ensued which claimed the lives of over 400,000 US men and women as they entered a war against Germany in Europe and against Japan in the Pacific. Two meetings took place in 1945 that were to shape the world for decades to come. The first came in February at Yalta in the Crimea. At this conference, President Roosevelt of the USA, Prime Minister Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, and Premier Joseph Stalin of the USSR met to discuss the makeup of the post-war world. Here it was agreed that Germany was to surrender fully to all of the Allies. No individual peace agreements were to be accepted. Germany was to pay a high price for its role in starting the conflict. It was to be divided between the Allies, with the Soviet Union receiving the large chunk of its eastern territories. Its capital, Berlin, was similarly to be divided into 4 separate zones of occupation as a temporary measure before more detailed plans could be worked out for Germany's future. Germany would pay reparations to the Allies totalling $40 billion, with the USSR receiving half of that amount. The United Nations, that idea put forward by Roosevelt back in Tehran, was to be formalised and created. At its head was to be a Security Council with 5 permanent members. Each of these, the USA, the UK, France, the USSR and China, was to receive the power of veto over any vote that took place. This meant that all countries had to agree on major decisions which took place at the UN. The first meeting was to be in June 1945 in San Francisco. Other agreements at Yalta chiefly included the USSR. The USA were eager to press Stalin for commitment to the war against Japan. Stalin agreed to this once Germany was defeated, on condition that the USSR was returned its land that had been lost to Japan in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. Back in Europe, all of the Allies were eager to exert influence on the future of Poland, which had been conquered by Nazi Germany, then by the Soviet Union in the course of the war. The USA, the UK and France backed the Polish government in exile, which reflected their Western societies as a democratic and capitalist body. The USSR favoured a pro-communist government situated in Lublin, in Poland itself. By way of compromise, at Yalta, the Allies agreed that post-war Poland would be governed by a mixture of these two bodies, and that free and fair multi-party elections would be held as soon as possible. But in the ever-changing tides of wartime, the agreements fixed at Yalta were not to stay fixed for long. In April 1945, the Soviet army captured Berlin, the capital of Germany. It claimed a hard-won victory over the Nazi state. The unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany was signed in the morning of May 7, 1945. The Nazi leader, Adolf Hitler, had committed suicide in his bunker. In his place stood General Alfred Jodl, the chief of staff of the German army. Following the German surrender, the Allies met once more. This conference at Potsdam, near Berlin in July 1945, saw Stalin as the only presiding leader that had seen his country through the war. In the USA, President Roosevelt had died, being replaced by his Vice President Harry Truman, who now represented America at the Potsdam Conference. Truman was much more suspicious of Stalin's intentions than his predecessor, and he held his own critical view of communist ideology. Britain had been through an election in 1945, and its famed wartime leader, Winston Churchill, had in fact been voted out of office. The new incumbent was a socialist, Clement Attlee of Britain's Labour Party. Attlee was more sympathetic to leftist ideology than his ally Truman, but he was more concerned with rebuilding war-torn Britain, which had after all been one of his key election promises. At Potsdam, the agreements made at Yalta now seemed a distant memory. The Soviet Army's presence in Poland prevented any Western-backed government from interfering in the runnings of that country. The communist government based in Lublin was in effective control of Poland's future. Stalin had also changed his mind about Germany. He now wanted complete and permanent dismemberment of the German state, ensuring that Germany could never again recover its industrial might that had, arguably, been a cause for Nazi expansion in the first place. Attlee and Truman refused Stalin access to the German industrial heartlands in the Ruhr. This he had requested in order to gain his own reparations for the costly Soviet war effort. There were, however, some significant agreements at Potsdam too. It was agreed between the Allies that a process of denazification take place in Germany, with its remaining key leaders being put on trial for their war crimes. Germany, for the moment, was to be governed by an Allied Control Council from Berlin, with each of the Allied powers having a role in governing and rebuilding the defeated nation. The border between Poland and Germany was also settled, an issue which had been a source of disagreement before. With Germany's surrender, the remaining front in the war was that against Japan in the Far East. In 1945, it was clear that the small island nation of Japan, with its limited resources, could not sustain a prolonged war in the Pacific. But the proud Japanese military was prepared to pay a heavy price in blood for every square mile of territory that it held. The American forces that captured the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa faced some of the bloodiest action in the war, facing heavy losses in the face of Japanese soldiers that simply refused to surrender. If the war was to be won in the Pacific using conventional weapons, it seemed clear that the Allies would need vast amounts of resources and troops for a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland. But the Americans had an alternative up their sleeve. Since 1942, scientists have been collaborating with the US military to develop a weapon that would yield firepower hitherto unseen by the likes of man. This enterprise, codenamed the Manhattan Project after its first headquarters in New York, produced in 1945 an atomic weapon that gave the USA unrivaled military might. The USA had kept quiet about this development with its ally, the USSR. Although Soviet spies had infiltrated the project at its research base in Los Alamos, on an official basis at least, Stalin knew nothing about the development of this new American superweapon. It didn't encourage much trust between the Allies, therefore, when President Truman dropped a subtle hint about the atomic bomb to Stalin at the beginning of the Potsdam Conference. Truman called it a new weapon of unusual destructive force, but failed to reveal much more than this. His reluctance to share information was in some ways consistent with the status quo that had existed between the Allies throughout the war anyway. Earlier in World War II, the British had not shared their ability to crack the German Enigma codes with the Soviets, fearful that such information might be leaked back to the Germans. Instead, the British had sent vital intelligence discovered through Enigma to the Russians via an anonymous radio operator called Lucy. Another element of mistrust had arisen when US sailors, taking much needed supplies to the USSR, found themselves isolated in Russian ports and had their movement restricted by Soviet authorities who were fearful of spies. In all, the wartime bond between the Allies had not been the most harmonious of relationships. In August 1945, the USA's new president signed the order for 2 of America's new atomic bombs to be dropped on Japan. The 2 bombs laid waste the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 people, most of whom were civilians. As the pilots of the American bomber, the Enola Gay, looked back on the destruction that had been wreaked by the first bomb, they remarked, "My God, what have we done?" 4 years later, owing to secrets that it had learned from its spies in the Manhattan Project, the Soviet Union too detonated its own atomic weapon. With the rifts that had emerged between the Allies after World War II, these 2 nuclear superpowers now entered a period of fragile peace underscored by deep and lasting hostility. This is the beginning of the period known to history as the Cold War. Thank you for watching this episode of the History Chronicles. I hope you enjoyed it. There'll be more on the Cold War to follow. Please do like and subscribe, support our Patreon, and I'll see you next time for another episode talking about the wonders of history.